Okay, we're going to go over probably one of my favorite subjects. Yes, this section is probably my favorite. You guessed it. Yarn! Yes, it's my favorite. And I wore a shirt for y'all today. See it? It's not hoarding if it's yarn. Yes, it's not. Okay, so let me excuse my noisy chair as I kind of get in close here because this is very important. Because yarn can be your number one obstacle when it comes to your knitting machines. It is the one thing that can cause you the biggest headaches. Obviously, we need it or we can't make anything, right? But some yarns will work better than others in your machines. Now, I'm going to give you a caveat here. Every machine is different. And that's probably not what you're going to want to hear. You're going to want to know what yarns will work perfectly in your machine every time. I have some suggestions. Great yarns to start with so you don't get frustrated. And some yarns to maybe avoid or be cautious or leery of because I know that they're problematic. Now, that being said, what has worked in my machines may not work in yours. And what has not worked in my machines may work in yours. So you're going to have to test it out. And if you're like me and you're a yarn addict, it's fun just to buy yarn. But the problem is if you have a yarn that you specifically want to use and then your machine hates it, it can become a problem really quick. And the yarn can damage your machine if not chosen properly. So the first thing that I want to talk about are yarns that do well in the Centro 48. I'm going to specifically talk about the Centro 48 or the Centros because they are a bit more problematic when it comes to yarn than the Addy 46 or the Addy 22. There are still yarns more based on weight of yarn or size that can be an issue versus the brand itself, if that makes sense. Okay, so first off, everybody asks me, this is probably the number one question I get on the daily, is what yarns work. Because if you have the machines are a great stash buster if you have a lot of yarn already. And I suggest if you do, a machine would be good for you to try to get through that. But your yarns might not work great. First off, a 3-weight or a 4-weight yarn are probably going to be your best bet. I would stay away from 5-weight yarn. That being said, there are some 5s that will work in these machines. I've used them. But I've also used a 5-weight in my first Centro and I cracked the housing because I forced it through. So first, let's go over what yarns I really love. I especially love for hats. I got started using Heartland by Lion Brand. I wish they had a little bit more selection in color, but you can see how it's a 4-weight yarn. See how it has a nice sheen to it. I am a sucker for shiny soft yarn. I like the way the hats fit. They're a little more generous in their fit. So if you have an Addy and it's a little, you have 2 less pins than a Centro, I would suggest if fit is an issue for you, like you have adult heads that you need to fit and it's an issue, go with a softer yarn that has a sheen to it. It's going to have a little bit more give, a little bit more stretch. So Heartland by Lion Brand is one, but I have a new favorite that I've discovered and I've been making some hats out of these, out of this, and it's Hirschner's Supreme Worsted Yarn, and you have to order it online. They do have a shop in Wisconsin, in the United States, but you can order it online and it's a nice affordable yarn. You don't get as much on the skein, but it's very similar. See how it has that sheen, that shine, very soft hat. The other brands that I like that have that sheen, soft, see the shiny. This is Karen's Simply Soft. Got it on clearance. Look at clearance yarn, always good. And the other one is Big Twist Shine. And that does really well. Those do fabulous. Go through like butter in my Centro 48. One other one that I don't have an example of, but I do have an example of a hat. Let me grab it. It is Hobby Lobby Yarn Beat Glowing. And it has that same sheen. It's very pretty. They have nice patterning. It works up really nice. Makes a nice hat that can fit a child all the way up to an adult. So those are my hands down favorites as of right now. Will that change? It could. Those yarns, the yarns like the hat that I'm wearing And then also, excuse my bumpy bumpies there, the Yarn Bee Glowing. If you look, I get lots of compliments on my tension. And I would love to say it's because I do it perfectly. That's not right. That's not it. It's the yarn, guys. If I use a yarn like this, it has a little bit more give and not a lot of memory. So you don't get those ridges. You still get them occasionally, but you won't get them like you will with other more acrylic-y, not as soft yarns. So I hope that makes sense. And I'll show you what some of those yarns look like in a moment. I have some hats down here that I can grab and show you. Okay, so some other yarns that work great when I make, and I'm not going to be sharing too much about stuffed animals, but I do a lot of stuffed animals. I use Big Twist Value, and you can make hats out of Big Twist Value. It's a great yarn. It's not as soft as the other yarns that I just mentioned, but I have no issues with this in the machine at all. None. And it's a great buy. It's available at Joann's if you have that. Here's another yarn that does very well, and I believe this is a 4. This is actually a 3 weight, so this gives you an idea of the size. This is a 3. I've made a sweater out of this yarn. This is a 5, so it's a 4, excuse me. So it's a little chunkier. 3, 4, okay? So it's a little finer. And I have on my Addy, I don't suggest doing this, but I have used 2 strands of the Mandala Lion Brand yarn in my Addy, and it went okay. So you just have to be really, really careful. But that just goes to show that Addy does maybe a little bit better. I would never try that on my Centro, but it works. So that's another yarn that I find does pretty well. I've not had issues with tucked or drop stitches, and we'll get into those a little bit later. But now, the no-nos. Talk about, oh wait, I have one other one that I tried, and I think I have an example of this. Hirschner's, the same one, the same brand where I get this shiny yarn. See the difference too? They have their worsted 8, and it's very similar to the Big Twist, maybe just a little bit softer than the Big Twist. Let me give you an example if I can find it. Here we go. This is done in the worsted 8, this hat here. And it knits up nice. It has a little bit more memory, but not near as bad as maybe the Big Twist Value. But it makes a nice hat. It's just not, and it's thicker. So it would actually be warmer, I think, maybe than one of these hats, just because it seems a little thicker, even though it's still a 4 weight. All right, so now the other thing I want to talk about is no-no yarns. Now, things that can happen. One, like I said, if you read in your instructions on your machines, it'll say it can do a 5. I think I might have, I'm going to show a bear that I made with a 5 yarn. Give me just a minute here and I'll show that to you. That went through my Centro and I didn't have any issue. But I just really don't suggest using a 5 weight yarn because you are going to have issues with it. I tried early on. I have a fuzz on my mouth. Sorry about that, guys. This is a 5. I'm almost positive this is a 5 because it's very, very thick. I don't think it's, I think it's a 5. I'm pretty sure. Well, anyways, this kind of gives you an idea of thickness. Like, I'm going to show you the difference. See, I'm pretty sure it's a bulky weight. It looks like, oh, this would be good. It would make a nice hat. You've got some nice patterning. I love this yarn. And you'll notice I don't have any I love this yarn brand in my stash here. I've used it on occasion and I do love it, but I have had some of the colors of I love this yarn brand yarn. This is a Hobby Lobby brand, or you can get it at Hobby Lobby, where it will tuck stitches. So a lot of times, unless there's something I absolutely need a certain color and I can't get it in the yarns that I know will work really well, I kind of avoid the yarns that I've had issue with, even though I love them. Another one I've had issue with that I made something out of was this yarn is from Hobby Lobby, and it's Yarn ID. Comes really cute with the brown wrapper on it. I managed it. I got through it, got my project done, but I had a lot of tuck stitches. The yarn's very soft when it's knitted up, but the machines, and that was on my Addy. So no, this was on my Centro. I'm sorry, I misspoke. So sometimes yarns, you will think they're going to work and they just are problems. So just know, kind of avoid 5s. Just know that if you're having issue, it's not necessarily what you're doing, not necessarily. It may be your yarn and your machine doesn't like your yarn. So the last yarn that I'm going to talk about, because I could talk about yarn all day long. I'm going to talk about this last brand, and then I'm going to show a suggestion that I have and just talk about the process when you're using your yarn. And a couple tips. I'll also cover it again in troubleshooting. But this is really pretty yarn. I made some stockings out of this, like some house socks or whatever. But lots and lots of tuck stitches. This is a yarn that I have lots and lots of, and most all of you do, because it's easily, you can see my fuzz flying around from all my yarn, found at most stores. It's Red Heart Super Saver yarn. They have a million colors. It's super great. You can do lots of things like on looms and crocheting and knitting, but for whatever reason, the knitting machines, some knitting machines do okay. But this yarn is known for tucking stitches. And by tucking, they like stick together. And so I just want to warn you, especially if you're starting out, kind of avoid the Red Heart Super Saver yarn at first. Now, when you start to feel more confident about what you're doing, try it. See if it'll go through your machine. See if you have any issue with it. But I would wait until you're comfortable with what you're doing. Comfortable with casting on. Comfortable with your tension as you're cranking. Comfortable with casting off. And then try the yarns that have a tendency to be a little bit more problematic. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is when you are making your project. I've kind of talked about this in other videos, but I have a plastic bin that I sit on the floor and I throw my yarn into it. Now, if I can do a center pull on yarn, center pull, that is what's suggested, right? But this is the problem. Every time I do a center pull on a yarn, I end up with a bit of yarn vomit where you pull and a big old chunk comes out. And you can usually manage to get through it. And then once you get through that, then usually it goes okay. And you can do the center pull and it's totally fine. When I first started, I didn't even know what center pull was, guys. Didn't know enough about yarn to even know that. And I would have people watch my videos and they'd say center pull, center pull. But this was the thing I was using in most of those videos. I was using the Lion Brain Heartland. It doesn't have a center pull. It rolls from the outside. So it's an outside pull. So I would throw it into my bin and then I will pull it up, loosen some. So I don't have a tight tension on my machine, where it's, getting bound up, and then I'll crank. So that's but people would tell me use center pull. Well, this doesn't have that. So some yarns don't have it. This brand does from Hirschner's, but almost all the times that I've pulled center pull on these, I've gotten a little bit of yarn vomit. So I have a suggestion, not to say you have to get one of these, but it's a tip. If you want to wind your yarn into a ball before you start your project, it will help you. It will. I sometimes, or most of the time, I'm lazy and I don't like to do that ahead of time because I just want to get into my project, right? But it is helpful because one, it helps so you can keep the proper tension without getting any drag in your yarn. Two, you'll know if there's knots in the yarn. And I hate to say it, sometimes you buy even the more expensive brands. I don't have it too much in the Heartland Lion brand, but usually so far, and each one of these worsted, even though I love it, the Supreme worsted, there'll be a knot. And I don't like to put knots into my projects. We'll talk about that at another time. But if I'm aware that they're in that skein of yarn or that ball of yarn ahead of time, I can kind of prepare for that. So this is I think it's called a Knit Picks yarn winder. It's a handy tool to have. And you can pre-wind your yarn into cakes. And let me show you what those look like. You can pre-wind them into cakes like this. Here's a smaller one. Here's a bigger one. Now if you want to use a skein of yarn like this, you're going to need to do multiple of them because it can only handle so much. So you'll have 3, probably about that size out of one of these, maybe at least 2. But it is helpful because you'll have a nice cake. You'll have your center pull where you can pull out of the center. And then you won't have the tension issue or the knots or whatever. You can just do your project without any trouble. So I'm going to give you just two little tips on yarn when it's winter time or when it's really dry. There have been a few people that have done this. I've not tried, or I have tried dryer sheets. You can, when you're putting your yarn through the machine, like, you have it feeding in there, you can put a dryer sheet and hold over your yarn to keep the static down, and that will help with the tuck stitches. So if you have a yarn that's tucking, and come winter, a lot of the yarns will do it. Sometimes some of the yarns that normally wouldn't. If the humidity changes drastically, you might have trouble. So a dryer sheet, but I know sometimes people don't want to put that onto their yarn. So something I have done is a little silicone earplug, and I'll go over that in the troubleshooting section again and actually show you what that looks like and where I placed it on the machine to run my yarn over it to help with the static, so that you don't have those tucked or drop stitches. So anyways, that's what I got for you in the yarn section. But again, I just want to reassure you that if you're struggling with your machine, maybe try one of those yarns that I mentioned in the beginning, if you can get your hands on some of those, just starting out, because it's going to be a lot easier if you can find a yarn that your machine loves. Then you're not going to be battling with the yarn, and you can learn how to properly, get your tension and everything down, and your cast on and your cast off, and all of that with a yarn that's not going to give you trouble. So yes, now you have to go buy some more yarn, because that's what we do, right? We're yarn addicts, or at least I am. I love it. Yarn. I have yarn everywhere. So anyway, thank you for watching this section. And again, if you have questions about yarn, if you have yarn that you love, I'd love to hear what yarn that is.